First off, this is my first post. I apologize for any spelling and grammatical errors. Second, understand that at the time this occurred, I was not living the healthiest of lifestyles. I quit using heroin when I was 25 and moved to France for 5 years. I just recently moved back to the States this past summer. This is relevant because it speaks to my mindset at the time all of this occurred, and why I was comfortable taking the absurd risks I took. I was a drug fiend. Anyway, on to the story. When I was 20, I had moved from Baltimore to the Eastern Shore, thinking the distance would help mitigate my habit. It didn't. Instead, I just ended up driving to Baltimore every couple of days and buying several $100s worth of heroin instead of just buying less on a daily basis. In the process, I got to know a lot of odd people. Some of them hacks. In Baltimore, a hack is someone who operates as a cabbie illegally. Often, they take people into the city to pick up their drugs, or just charge half the rate of a legit cab driver. I had met an older guy at a Dunkin' Donuts in Dundalk who did this. Now, I wasn't in the habit of using hacks, but one night, my ride went down on a one-way street, the wrong way, in front of a police officer, and we were pulled over and searched. It ended up the idiot had brought his stash of pot with him, so we were arrested and sent to BCDC. God, I was pissed. Around midnight that night, they released me. It ends up that not only had my friend admitted ownership of the marijuana, but the reason they'd used to search us, that his license was showing up as suspended, was bullshit. And my friend's lawyer had called them on it. So there I was, in the middle of Baltimore City, with no ride, nowhere to go, dope sick, in the middle of December. They released the men and women separately, and my friend's cell phone was still off at the time when I tried to call it. It ends up he had been released several hours earlier, but had left his phone in the truck. For anyone that hasn't had the pleasure of being arrested, they impound your vehicle. So, if you're lucky enough to get processed and released after 5 p.m. or before 8 a.m., you're out of luck getting your vehicle back. Not to mention, another couple $100s in the hole. As I mentally ran through my list of options, I remembered the hack I'd met earlier that week, and decided to give him a try. I figured that at the least, if he was still awake, I could pay him to help me cop, and drop me off at the Greyhound bus station to wait out the night. Well, I called. Not only was he up and about, but he was also only about a 10-minute drive away from where I was being released. The fact that he was still up and about at 1 in the morning may have given normal people pause. I just assumed he was probably a crackhead, tweaker, or some such, and wrote it off as luck. Within a half an hour, he showed up, and I clambered into the long, gray sedan, just grateful to be out of the cold, and back on solid ground. Now, to give you an idea of the way this guy came off, the best way I can think to describe him is gray. Everything about him was just gray. His vehicle was a medium, dinged up gray. His hair was longish, and a deep, solid gray. Even his pallor seemed gray. I remember he had the face of a postmenopausal woman. Sort of drolly, if you know what I mean. Soft. In retrospect, the guy was creepy as all get out, but at the time, he just seemed unexceptional. And really, in the drug world, there are so many weird people that you're forced to deal with on a daily basis, that unless someone comes off as blatantly volatile, you eventually learn to just ignore the crazy. If you don't, you'll drown in it. We managed to cop in Baltimore. There's always someone out. I asked the guy to take me to the Greyhound station, just wanting to get well and to curl up till I could think about catching a bus. And he just sort of looked at me, looked down, and looked back up, and then asked if I wanted to go watch TV at his place till the buses began running. Looking back, I remember feeling a bit hesitant, but the man seemed so unexceptional, such a non-entity, that I couldn't imagine him being a threat. And if I'm entirely honest, I just wanted a clean, warm place to get it on. I was well beyond dope sick at this point, and my all-consuming thought was just to get straight. Taking my silence for hesitation, I remember him telling me not to worry, that he wasn't going to try anything. I ought maybe to have mentioned that I'm a 5'6", 100-pound female, 20 years old at the time, and that the bus station wasn't the safest place for a tiny female like myself to be hanging out at 2 o'clock in the morning, that he was just trying to help. Well, F me. But I thanked him, said sure, and we proceeded to drive out towards the county. To this day, I'm still not sure what direction we'd even gone in. Just that wherever it was, he lived. It was about half an hour outside of the city, and that it was not in the woods, but in a heavily wooded area. As we neared his house, he started acting a bit strange. Not enough to set off the alarm bells yet, but still. I'll never forget him saying that either the police chief of that county, or the chief's son, lived in the same cul-de-sac that he did. That they were friends, and that the guy had helped him out of what he termed a few predicaments. The house was right on a lake, with a dock in the backyard. I have no idea what county this was in, and no one I've tried describing it to has ever been able to pinpoint it either. It was totally alien to me. We pulled into his driveway, and I was shocked to see that his house was closer to being a mansion than the hovel I was assumed I was in for. He would go on to tell me, as he parked and we walked up to the door, that it had belonged to his mother, who had recently passed away. Here's this ratty little man, with a ratty little car, and his ratty little clothes, and he's living in this extremely, well, not nice, but expensive house, driving around all day and night for pocket change, and basically living at Dunkin' Donuts. I was more than a bit skeptical. When we went inside, the situation became even stranger, but at least more familiar, more in line with what I've seen of the guy so far. The house was covered in two things, dust and knickknacks. And when I say covered, I mean covered. Every square inch of surface space was covered in tacky little porcelain angels and dollar store crap, shelves, tables, the top of the ginormous old box television. Even the kitchen was covered in them. The kitchen itself I only saw for a brief moment, but I'll never forget how even the sink was filled with the things. There were the obligatory dollies that all old people seem to have in spades, all of them coated in dust and discolored. I asked where the bathroom was, and excused myself to go get high. I was getting pretty weirded out by this point, and just wanted to get straight, so I could decide what to do. I did my thing, and went back to the living room, which was the first room you walked into whenever you came in the door. I didn't want to go any deeper into the house. I wanted to take a look at the lock on the door, create an exit strategy, and hope I didn't really need one. That hope was quickly dashed. The first thing the guy did was bring me a glass of water and a handful of pills. Puzzled, I asked him what the pills were for. He said, to sleep. Now, it's 3 a.m. at this point, and I have to be at the bus station by 6. At most, we have maybe 2 hours before we will have to leave. I tell him I don't think that's a great idea, since falling asleep isn't on the agenda, that we don't have time for a quick nap. Well, he starts to become pretty insistent that I take the pills. Believe me, if we weren't so out in the middle of nowhere, not to mention it being December, and bitter cold, at this point, I'd have booked. Instead, I sort of laughed and took 2 of the pills out of his hand, stuck them in my mouth, and took a sip of the water, saying, well, what the hell? Immediately he brightened and shuffled off to get another glass of water, which I'd requested. Looking back, I shouldn't have even drank the bloody water. Idiot. I spit out the pills and shoved them in the seat of the sofa. This whole time, we've been talking about little things. Baltimore, local politics, music, nothing deep. At this point, he starts asking me about chemicals, about drugs. Specifically, what sort of drugs would knock someone out, but not harm them. How much you would need of what for someone, say, tiny like myself. I try to act as if this is entirely normal conversation fodder. At this point, it seemed to me that my existence depended on my not registering how abnormal the entire situation was. I think my thought process at the time, and especially as time went on, you'll see what I mean shortly, was that I couldn't act as if I knew what was going on. That I couldn't act as if there was something strange or alarming occurring. That he would be stupid and let me live if he knew that I knew exactly what was going on. That I need to see him as a non-threat. The whole time we were having this discussion, by the way, the guy kept trying to get behind me. At one point, he succeeded and started rubbing my shoulders. I just laughed said I wasn't a fan of massages, and that I needed to run to the bathroom. When I came back, I made sure to sit on the sofa that was up against the wall, and I'm looking around for a phone, but I don't want to ask for one, because I don't want him to know that my cell phone is dead. Yeah, another great stroke of luck. My cell phone had died about 5 minutes after I called the creep to come pick me up. Now, this whole time, the guy has been pacing around the living room, sitting for a few minutes, only to get back up again, walk back and forth a bit, and then sit back down. He began talking about his mother, how she collected these knickknacks, how she died, and how he'd been thinking about renovating the house, but hadn't had the heart to make any changes to anything yet. So he says he wants to show me something. He wants to show me the upstairs. Why I didn't run screaming out of the place, I don't know. I think part of me was still very much hoping that I was misreading the situation, that the guy was just lonely, and creepy, and socially maladaptive. Not actually dangerous or anything. But here, we have yet one more horror film trope coming into play. Creepy obsession with mother, and bizarre, dust-filled house, perfectly preserved in memory of mom, down to the last glass she used, still sitting on the kitchen table. I shit you not. And now, the guy wants to show me the upstairs. He wants to show me her room. So I follow him up the stairs. And at first, he makes it obvious he wants me to go up before him. But I wasn't having any of that. We get to the second story. There were 3. I never made it to the third, however. And turn off down this hallway. And he opens the first door on his left. Goes in. I'm half expecting to see the body of his dead mom, laying on the bed or something. And find myself seriously relieved. And I find myself standing in just one more dust-coated room, full of crap. I don't remember much about the room. I remember the bed was made, and that I couldn't tell if the comforter was dark, or just covered in so much dust that it appeared that way. He gestured for me to sit down. I obliged. What followed was the worst of the experience. He sat down on the end of the bed next to me, and began talking about his mother. After a bit, he looked at me and said, "You're so beautiful. You look like a little girl. I bet little girls really like you." And I tried to lead the conversation back to his mom. He gets up and walks over to the far wall of the bedroom. Starts referring to our earlier conversation about drugs and knocking someone out. He asked me what I would use to knock out a child. What I would use to keep a child knocked out for long periods of time. Safely, of course. I'm trying, at this point, to act as if I'm still on point. As if I'm not finding this line of conversation to be dreadful, creepy, and horrible. I tell him I really don't know. I'm just a dope fiend. Not a chemist. He asked about heroin, and if that would be safe. At this point, I've just had it, and I think he can tell. He says, "I want to show you something." I begin to protest, to tell him that I have to use the restroom, but he insists. He pushes on the cheap wood paneling on the wall, and a large square of it swings open. He gestures inside, says he's been working on it for a few years, that it's just big enough for a small woman, but made for a child. It's a sort of cot, and there are loops on the ends, for rope, or some other restraint, I'm sure. I noped out of the bedroom, down the stairs. I didn't run. I just told him I had to go to the restroom again. While I am walking, shaking down the stairs, I pull my cell phone out of my purse and mimic dialing on it. I was lucky that he stayed behind too close up the bedroom and that thing in the wall, so he didn't see that my phone wasn't even turning on. I pretended to be having a conversation with a friend of mine, and at the point that he showed up, began loudly recounting what had transpired that evening to my friend. I told him how I'd called that nice gent we had met. I had been with my friend Tom at the time we'd met this guy at Dunkin' Donuts to pick me up, and then I was at the guy's house, who would be leaving shortly. I then pretended that my friend had offered to come pick me up from the bus stop, and in one respect, I was lucky. The guy knew I was living out of town, but he didn't know I was living 4 hours away, or that any friend of mine would have to make that hellishly long trip if they were going to come pick me up. I told my friend that I'd head out to the bus stop ASAP, and that I'd see him soon. I still remember the look on the guy's face as I said that. It darkened. You know, the look that snotty, spoiled little kids will get when someone actually dares to tell them no. It was that look, but worse. Because there was something almost perverse about seeing it so openly displayed on the face of a 50-something-year-old man. So I started to grab my purse and zip up my coat, all the while gibbering on about how my friend remembered him and had said to tell him hi. It seemed, at the time, that there were two things that were of the utmost importance at the time. The first, to make him feel that I hadn't found him, or anything he'd said or displayed, odd. I didn't want him to think that I'd be some sort of threat to his plans, or his well-being, if he let me leave. Secondly, I wanted him to know that he was identifiable, and that someone, at least, someone who could identify him, knew I was with him. This is pretty much the end of the story, although I had one more, far worse encounter with the same guy a couple of weeks after this incident. He took me to the bus station and acted shitty the entire time we were driving there. The second encounter convinced me that not only was I lucky to be alive, but I had spent several hours in the home of a serial killer. Do I think he had done anything yet at the time I spent the terrifying early morning at his home? No. I think he was gearing up to, though. And by the second, brief encounter I had with the guy, I'm positive he had. I don't know how to put it. That uncertainty he displayed with me was gone. I think by that point, he had crossed the line. In closing, I will say this. I did take down his license number as he was leaving that morning, and I did contact a friend of mine who was a police officer. A year or so after all this happened, my friend called me and asked if I still had the guy's information. I didn't. He'd lost it, if he'd ever really bothered to write it down at all, and there had been several disappearances of young children in the very same areas that the guy, in our second, blissfully brief encounter, mentioned that he trolled. Just scoping out the little girls. I did try to find the man, and began by going to the Dunkin' Donuts that he had hung out at. The owner, who said the guy had spent every single morning there for a couple of years, told me that he had just quit coming the same week that this happened, and I think I finally figured out why he hung out there every morning. The day I went there looking for the guy, I noticed that there was a bus stop right in front of the Dunkin' Donuts. A bus stop full of elementary school kids. First of all, I must say that I'm a massive fan of this page, and I've learned so much about keeping myself and others around me safe. This is a story from when I was 18. I'm 25 now. My mom and I were regular attendees of our local church. We both attended different midweek groups. I met with some of the younger, and my mom went to one with some of the middle-aged people. Anyway, my mom's group was about a half a mile from our house, and we didn't own a car, so she would often walk there on her own for the 7:30 start. This was fine in summers because it wasn't getting dark until around 9ish. When our group ended at 10, she would call me, and I would start walking to meet her, to walk her home. We would usually meet her not too far from her group, but we would always stay on the phone until we met. On the night in question, all was usual. She called. I got my trainers on, locked the house, and began jogging to meet her. I usually ran because it was good training for my rugby, and despite being a big guy, 6'2" and about 19 stone, 290 pounds at the time, I have an overactive imagination and get creeped by darkness and shadows. In order to meet Mom, I had to cross our local park and go through a dark patch of trees behind some of the local houses. It was usually just before these trees that we met. Anyway, I'm running. Mom's walking. We are talking about her evening, and who was there when she suddenly says, "Joe, hurry up. I think someone's following me." My heart rate goes through the roof, and I start to panic, so I start sprinting, still with some way to go until I meet her. I tell her to stay calm, and keep her updated on my position. My mom is a tough chick, thick-set, strong, but short. I hear my mom scream for the phone, and also hear it in the distance ahead. "Get the fuck away from me! What do you want? I don't have any money, and you can have my phone if you want it.
I had only ever heard her swear once before, when I had really pushed her and been really rude. This panicked me even more. I ran like I had never ran before. The distance I had to cover usually took me a good 45 to 60 seconds to run, but I did it so much faster. It's amazing how your body has this whole other level of physical exertion when adrenaline kicks in. By now, I can see them in the distance. My mom's screams are piercing through me. I can see the guy has her by the hair and is dragging her about. She was fighting him all the way. I shouted, "Get the fuck off of my mom," and charged in. He was tall and lean, but had hardly any weight to him, maybe 180 pounds max. What happened next is something of a blur, and only through me and Mom talking about it have we come to some conclusion on what really happened, and the guy's injuries, of course. He saw this hulk of a man charging him, and he immediately let go of her. She fell to the ground sobbing, and I tried to run. I caught him fairly easily, and took him to the ground hard. Mom says I took him clean off the ground, before smashing his head and shoulder into the ground. He grunted, and we rolled, but I beat him up. In rugby, when you tackle someone, you have to be quick onto your feet, so you can challenge for the ball and try to win the ball for your team. It's at this point that I blank out, but apparently, I hopped over the guy, head-butted him, and repeatedly beat his face. Someone from the houses behind had heard the screams and called the police. One guy from the street was a policeman, and had come out to investigate. I remember him dragging me off the guy, and it was then that I saw the blood and scratch marks on my arms. He had clawed me, but I hadn't noticed. The police arrived quickly, and we had to be interviewed by them, which is all a bit blurry. Apparently, the off-duty copper, as I suppose anyone would have, seeing me beat his ass. The guy was on their records as a thief. He had mugged a girl in town not that long before. When police interviewed him, he claimed he was just robbing her, but I'm not sure. He's in prison now, thankfully. I have never been so scared in my life. I had always imagined situations like this, where I was the hero saving people, but I always wondered if I would be able to react when the moment came. Thankfully, I haven't had to since. It just makes me so glad that I was being a good son to my mom and meeting her, even though I never really wanted to and never saw the need. You never think bad stuff will happen to the ones you love until it happens. So, guy who attacked my mom, let's not meet ever again.
I'm not even sure where to post this story. This seems like a good place. I can pretty much guarantee that most people would not want to meet this guy. I was 19 years old when this happened, and incarcerated in an Ohio penitentiary at the time. I'm now a 30-year-old man with a wife and kids and a normal job, so sharing this story isn't really something I ever get the chance to do, as prison stories aren't really a great impression on anyone. First, if you think the stories about rape or gay sex in prison are exaggerated or myths, you would be completely wrong. It's most definitely a thing. I was never a victim of rape, nor did I ever feel like my butt virginity was in jeopardy. However, I did get placed in some really awkward situations. For example, after a few days of being in general population, guys will start hitting on you. And I'm not talking about, "I lost my number, can I have yours?" No. One of the nicest ways I was hit on was by a guy who was bent over a picnic table in the yard. You know, knees on the bench and elbows on the table. Looked back at me and said, "You ready for some pussy yet, Robbie?" And as he smiled while waving his butt at me. Also, if a guy introduces himself as Sweet Pussy Jim, he's most likely a hooker offering his services to you. So, I had been in general population for about a week when I met him. Jerry. I had known enough by this point that just by the way he acted, he was one of the sisters. I had also learned not to talk with these guys unless you wanted to be on other people's radar as a potential sister. Jerry was staring at me, and I was doing my best not to make eye contact and tried to avoid any awkward situation. He didn't care though. He came up to me and said, "Do you want to see my baby?" I guess I thought he was referring to his boyfriend, So I just smiled and said, "Nah, I'm good." Jerry says, "Please, come see my baby." Again I say, "I'm good." Jerry walks away pissed off, talking to himself. And I'm just sitting there wondering what the fuck that dude was talking about. About 15 minutes pass, and here comes Jerry again. "Do you want to see my baby?" And I quickly tell him no for the third time. Again, he walks off, mumbling and shaking his head. A few more minutes go by, and here comes Jerry again. "Do you want to see my baby?" I tell him, "Listen, man, I really don't want to meet your baby. I'm good." I'm still pretty calm at this point, and knowing that this dude was more than likely someone's girl, I really didn't want to throw the first punch and have to deal with the consequences from it. Well, this routine goes on for the rest of the day. Jerry would come to me a couple of times each hour and ask me, "Do you want to see my baby?" And every time I would say no. And he would just walk off, shaking his head and mumbling some shit. Towards the end of the day, I had been asked, "Do you want to see my baby?" Probably somewhere close to 50 times. And to be honest, I was starting to get curious. I had also noticed that it seemed like Jerry was cycling between about 5 different guys and asking us all if we wanted to see his baby. I started to figure out it wasn't who was his baby, but rather what. I was genuinely curious at that point. For some reason, I guess I thought his baby was going to be some drawing or craft of an actual baby. And I'll tell you now, it wasn't either of those. And if you're thinking it's his dick, well, that wasn't it either. I figured, fuck it. Here comes Jerry. "Do you want to see my baby?" I said, "How about this? Will you leave me the fuck alone if I come see your baby?" Jerry gets excited. Yeah! Come look at my baby!" So, against my better judgment, I follow Jerry to his bunk. He pulls a shoebox out from underneath his rack. He's doing it very slow and gentle, as if he's trying not to wake his baby up. Now he's cradling the shoebox in his left arm, rocking it, and begins to take the lid off. As he's taking the lid off, he looks at me, smiles and says, "Shh, it's a girl. Her name's Julie." I wasn't ready. Oh man, what the fuck, dude? I gagged, and dry heaved and walked away. What Jerry revealed to me as his baby was a humongous turd, probably about 7 to 9 inches long, with a pink bow wrapped around it. Apparently, Jerry had a bowel movement during sex the night before, and considered it his baby girl. He did, however, keep his word, and never spoke another word to me again after that. Jerry, I hope you're in a better place now. Like the nut house. But this memory still pops up in my head every now and again, and I truly hope none of us ever have to meet you or your baby